So here we are. Today we're going to go through a little crash course in how it is that we can see God's name within us and exactly how we can articulate that. It's very important because we understand that our body and our consciousness is a mirror, a map for how to see God, but sometimes we only get that in a general sense. Today, I want to take you through how we articulate that in every aspect of our consciousness and in every aspect of God's name. We're going to do that by looking at the four-letter name of God and also looking at how the 10 Sefirot are articulated within that name, and then, of course, within ourselves. That means that by looking within, I can have a more detailed picture, a more animated and integrated picture of how I am a reflection of God. So here I want to start with God's name. You're seeing on your screen four letters, a Yud and a Hey and a Vav and a Hey. This is the name we'll often see in prayer books when we're praying. And sometimes we just read it and think of it as one of God's names. Every one of God's names corresponds to one of God's behavior. This name corresponds to how God is bringing the world into existence all the time. We see that in the name because Hoveh, present tense, means to be. It's the same root. So that Hey and Vav and Hey expresses that everything is coming to be through this name. Then the Yud is continuous. So it's something that is ongoing, can be conjugated with a Yud in front of it. That first letter Yud means continuous being. So this name, which we're going to call Havaya in this class, that is how God interacts with the world by bringing it into being in a continuous state. But now, how do the 10 Sefirot, and for a more detailed class on the 10 Sefirot, I'll refer people to my Intro to Kabbalah or Kabbalah for All class, where we go through in 5 weeks. Today, we're going to do a very cursory description of them. Understanding how the Sefirot map onto this name is the key to understanding more details of how this name articulates within us. And you'll see that it corresponds in just about every way to the shape of the letters, the number value of the letters, and the name of the letters as well, because the whole thing is really flowing out of this one creative act that God is doing. Going back to this map of how the Sefirot appear within everything, in fact, I want to go through and give you a sense of what they each mean. This first bracket up on top is intellect. This bracket down here, the 6 on the bottom, is emotions. And finally, Malchut is expression. And so going through, and again, I have a more detailed class, of course, going through. The first that we generally talk about is Chokhmah, or wisdom. That is the spark of how anything appears in the cosmos. So before something can appear in, let's call it God's thought, it has to have the potential to manifest, but it hasn't manifested yet. So imagine there's things that can't manifest. Something, anything is being brought into the potential to manifest, but still hasn't yet manifest. It only appears as a point. It has no definition whatsoever. That is Chokhmah, the ability to manifest without any manifestation whatsoever. Next comes Bina. Bina is where that point is now drawn out in a very lofty level. We're calling this God's thought, and expanded multidimensionally so that it has, so to speak, space. Imagine, if you will, if I was drawing a picture and I put my pencil right on the paper. And before I drew anything, what have I now drawn? I've drawn a point. I haven't moved my hand, and there may be a dot with some space, but imagine you could shave off the entire space of the dot. You're left with just a perfect point. If I ask you, what picture am I drawing? Am I about to draw? It could be anything. It could be anything I hear in my class. That represents a point that has the potential to be any drawing on a page. And that's the same thing as Chokhmah. If you imagine something that has entered into the potential to express in the universe, but has not yet expressed, it now can be anything. That is Chokhmah. Bina is the ability to expand that. So the point now has definition. So now it has length, breadth, and depth. And one more piece we want to understand, which is Keter and Dot. So if you look at the top of the Sefirot and the middle one, those actually are one and the same. So in God's name, this appears as Keter. Keter would be the delight or the will that preceded that point of Chokhmah. So before I put my pencil on the page to draw, I have the desire and the will to draw something, and that preceded and created that point. But from the point of view of the picture, it came not from one of the dimensions of the picture. It came from somewhere entirely else. My delight in drawing, my desire to draw, my will to draw, that doesn't appear on the page, but that is what preceded the point abstractly, and that's what caused that point to begin. So we're going to talk about Keter in God's name in a moment, and that is where the point of Chokhmah comes from. Those three, Keter, Chokhmah, and Bina, are the intellect of God in God's name. And finally, going on, we have 6 emotional flows. We call these the midot in literature. The 6 emotional flows are mainly love and awe, loving kindness and strength, chesed and gevura. And then there's other offshoots from those, which we won't describe today, tiferet, netzach, hod, and yesod. Those are the 6, remember the number 6 emotional flows that come out from God's intellectual flow. Intuitively, we understand this just like us. If I think about something all day, I'm going to have strong feelings about it. We had, I think, the World Series last night. People that are thinking about baseball all the time have very strong feelings. You see it all come out in the game. Hooray for my team. And so it is with anything. When I have a strong emotion, it means that I have had a strong intellectual flow and connected to that. So that's God's 6 emotional attributes. And finally, Malchut, or royalty, represents expression. So in this case, we're talking about God's speech, like a ruler that decrees by speaking or even writing laws. Malchut is represented best by speech, and divine speech is an act of creation, as we know from Genesis. Now we're going to flip to the divine name and see how these 10 attributes articulate exactly onto each letter of the divine name. And after that, we'll see how we can understand ourselves as a map of the divine name and how we, as a piece of God, as a lamp of God, have that divine name within us. So to understand how they map, first we want to understand the qualities of each of the letters. And let me say that letters are more like stages in an algorithm, functions within an algorithm. If we think of God as the creative force that is continuously behind the universe, that's a little like an algorithm that's running or a computer program that's running. Any algorithm or computer program has steps, stages, various functions. It has its own language, in fact. In the creation of the world that's ongoing, that language is Hebrew. So key to understanding how the Sefirot map onto the divine name is understanding the function of each of the 3 letters in the 4-letter name of God. Now we're going to go through them. First letter is the Yud. The Yud is the letter that starts the 4-letter name of God. A Yud is, we've been talking about a point or a dot, the word that is most like a dot or a point in the whole alphabet. It does not touch anything else. It is hanging in midair. It has very little shape. It really is just sort of a little blob, a little point, a little dot, and it represents Chokhmah in the alphabet, in the 22-letter alphabet of the Hebrew language. So that starts the divine name, and that corresponds to when anything is brought into being in the universe, it starts as a point of pure potential within divine consciousness. It hasn't emerged in any way at all, and it emerges just as a point of divine light. So that point we want to understand is Chokhmah, and Chokhmah very much is articulated by the Yud in the 4-letter name of God. As well, we mentioned there's something called Keter, which is where Chokhmah comes from. Keter you can describe as will and also desire and even delight in its innermost state. And so when I have an idea or think of something, it came from what gives me desire, what gives me delight, what I want, and then that will occur to my mind to bring that point out. The same thing, that is a map of something happening within God. And so God also has something called Keter, which is God's delight and God's will. And from that, every point of Chokhmah emerges. How is that illustrated in the letter? If you look, there's this little thorn, this little piece on top of the Yud. That represents the Keter from which Chokhmah is derived. If we were talking about my drawing, if the first point when I put my pencil on the paper is the point of Chokhmah, Keter is perhaps, like I said, my desire, my will to make the drawing. That point emerged from that, and yet there's nothing on the page that you could say this is where the point came from. It's completely in another dimension than the page. So if you like, the non-dimensional vector through which that point appeared, that is Keter. And that is the point of the Yud, the crown, the thorn on the Yud in the divine name. The next letter we want to look at is, if I wanted to now take some point, but that point was much too lofty, much too high. Say it was a thesis from a great physics professor, and I want to try and explain that somehow to someone with my limited understanding of physics. I'd have to draw it down, so to speak, simplify it, convert it to something else, maybe use an analogy. There's many ways we can draw something down from one level to an entirely other level. We went over this last week. If you were to guess which is the letter that looks like a Yud that got stretched down, so now it's longer and reaching down. If we know the alphabet, what letter is that? A Vav, a Vav. And of course, that's also in the divine name. In the divine name, it is there as a function. So if I'm going to take this Yud and stretch it down in some way to make it applicable, and down, of course, doesn't mean down towards the ground. Down means in an abstract way to a lower state. That is going to look like a Vav, a Yud that is stretched out. And you'll find every single letter. We could go through all 22 letters, every single letter, as well as the final letters. Their shape, their name, and their number corresponds in every multidimensional way to exactly their function in this creative process. Today, we're just going through these 4 letters. So a Vav is very much Chokhmah being stretched down. In my consciousness, what does that mainly look like? When the intellect is moving towards some kind of speech or action, that is through emotion. If something occurs to me and I don't care anything about it, what will happen? Drifts off, does not come down to be spoken about or acted on. If something occurs to my intellect and I have strong emotions about it, what will happen? I will start to say things, I will start to do things, it will be drawn down. So the Vav represents the 6 emotions that we looked at, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. What is the number value of Vav? 6. Vav is 6. Of course, it corresponds to the 6 midot, and those are inter-included in the Vav within the divine name. So now we have the Yud in the divine name, which is that spark of Chokhmah, which, by the way, also is mirrored in my spark of Chokhmah. We have the Vav in the divine name, which takes care of the 6 midot, right? And Keter is also included within the Yud, but there's still 2 pieces missing. If you are keeping track, we're missing Bina, which is intellectual expansion, and we're missing Malchut, which is expression. You'll notice I made the same motion with my hands when I did it, just intuitively, something like this. A hey is something like this. I'm taking a point and I'm expanding it in every way so that it's usable, because an actual point, it has no dimension, it's not usable. I need to figure out what's contained in that potential and expand it so that then I can draw that down and express it. So what is the letter? We only have one left that might take a point and expand it in 1, 2, 3 dimensions to give it volume, to give it definition. That's the last letter left, which is the Hey. So let's look at the Hey, the final letter in the divine name, and the final letter in mapping out how the Sefirot are articulated in the divine name. The Hey represents expansion or expression. And you'll see this will apply both to God's intellect, so to speak, that point of Chokhmah that God brought into the universe without any expression has to expand before it can be drawn down. And then once it's drawn down, now it has to actually be expressed. The Torah uses the metaphor of speech to describe God's expression. And our metaphor of speech is a beautiful mirror of how God speaks to create the world. Let's look at the Hey. If we're starting with the point of Chokhmah, and now we want to expand it intellectually, this letter actually maps out drawing a point into 1, 2, 3 dimensions. So that point now becomes a cube, say. right? A point is 0 dimensions. Start with my line on top of the hay is that first dimension. A point that is drawn out in 1 dimension is called a line. Now, what happens if I take that line and all those points move out in a perpendicular direction? That is that leg of the hay, right? That is this vertical leg of the hay. That represents drawing this line down. So now I get what? Call it a square. So my point now has width, which you could say is how it applies to multiple areas. Right? This idea about physics might also apply to relationships, might also apply to nature, might also apply to story writing, all these different ways that this idea could express. That's the breadth of the idea. And then the depth of the idea, that's how far I can draw it down, how far I can simplify it to more and more basic concepts, right? Take the very abstract concept and draw it down to more and more simple terms. And then to get a square, you need a third dimension, and the yud here on the bottom left represents that third dimension. If you can imagine it pointing not upwards on the screen, but towards yourself on the screen, now you'll see that allows this original point to be drawn out into an actual cube. And that is the function of the hay. The hay takes that point of chokhmah, that is the yud, draws it out into a line by giving it breadth, draws it down again into a plane by giving it breadth and then depth, and finally creates actual three-dimensional space by bringing it out into a cube. If you can imagine in your own intellect, that is the process by which any inspiration you have, you can, by using any intellectual process of categorization or crystallization or analysis, expand that point into a three-dimensional idea. It also represents expression, as we'll see in a moment. So moving on, we now want to look at the four-letter name of God again, with all this in mind, so we can put the pieces together. So looking at these four letters, there's a first two and a second two that are distinct. The first two, the Yud and the Hey, this is, let's call it God's intellect, which is within God. The Vav and the Hey, that is God's emotions and expression, which is relating to creation. And if we go through, we see that Keter, which we described, that is the thorn on the Yud, which is what is leading God to have this point of inspiration. Chokhmah is the Yud itself, that represents the point through which anything comes into being, through which the universe is being created. And there's your point. Now, Bina, that is the intellectual process which expands that point. That is that first Hey. And we have length, depth, and this third dimension, as we saw. So we have now this point of Chokhmah has expanded into a full divine thought concept, let's call it. Finally, God has 6 midot that express. That's the 6 value of the Vav, which brings that divine thought down closer to creation, because God also has aspects of love and awe, etc. And finally, God expresses all that through Malchut, through the final Hey. And if we want to talk about how the Hey expresses speech, there's a few ways of doing it. One is the name of the Hey. Everybody say Hey with me. Ready? 1, 2, 3, Hey. Now make the sound of what a Hey makes. Ready? 1, 2, 3. What is that? It's breath. The very sound that a Hey makes is breath. And where does speech come from? Breath. You have to breathe to speak. Breath is the source of speech. So breath, the sound of air passing through my organ of speech, is what creates speech. And my organ of speech has how many openings that shape the breath? First, it passes through my throat. Ah, that's my throat. Then it passes through my palate, like, ah, yeah, yeah, yeah. You do that with your palate. Then it passes through your tongue, la, la, la. Then your teeth, then your lips. So I have, count them, throat, palate, lips, tongue, and teeth. I have 5 openings in my vocal organs. And what is the number value of Hey? 5. Beautiful. Right. So in every way we see number, shape, name, all these letters correspond exactly to their subfunctions within this larger algorithm of the divine name. We could go on now and show specifically how those express within us. We've touched on it, but the main point I want you to take from this crash course is that when I look inside, when I understand my consciousness and how it works, it is a perfect map of how those 10 Sefirot also articulate within that divine name of Yud and He and Vav and He. And even more so by mastering how my flow, coming from my desire and will, going through my chokhmah, my intellectual process, my emotions, and finally how I express, when I master that, it is in some way mastering a small piece of how the divine name is expressing in the world. And it is your immeasurably important puzzle piece that you have to add to the world. Thanks for joining us for this. Please look for more videos in the future. And certainly if you want a better explanation of the 10 Sefirot, I'll invite you to watch my class, Intro to Kabbalah.